Okay, hi everybody. Good to see you all today. Can you introduce yourselves to me really fast?
So let me start. My name is Nadim. We are calling in right now from Regenerativo. We are calling over as satellite internet connection. That means there is a delay of 1 second or 1.5 seconds. So yeah, just to be aware of that. And yeah, we are honored to be with you today here. And I have some awesome people here around me that are helping with the project here. But we are all volunteers right now at the project, starting with the permaculture garden and organic food. And then with, yeah, we are starting to restore the place, the building itself, and to listen to the land and see how we can regenerate and connect that to the local neighbors, show them how we can do like really productive organic farming, and are interested in learning. Yeah, we want to be showcasing that and inviting them, and yeah, it's a beautiful project to really be in contact with the nature, because it is in a nature reserve. It's a nature protected area where we're living right now. And the neighbors are Maya, so they hold a lot of Maya wisdom about how you can do agriculture in resonance with the nature and in collaboration. So it's a beautiful giving and receiving with them, from them. So, yeah. And I pass next to Adriel.
Hi, Lee. Is it Leah or Leah?
Leah.
Leah, good to meet you. I'm Adriel. Yeah, I'm here as well on this tiny project that Nadim just described to you. And yeah, we're working with regenerative principles like permaculture, regeneration of the land, the soil, the water, and creating a living laboratory ecosystem, a cultural ecosystem built around the Mayan civilizations, the old civilizations. And yeah, I'm just excited to be a part of that, and look forward to learning from you and your wisdom. So yeah, thank you. And I'll pass to Sebastian.
Hello. My name is Sebastian. I'm from Germany, and I'm here for volunteering. At the moment, I'm working in the garden. Yes, making pathways for the plants. Yeah. A lot of other things here in the house. Okay, thank you.
Hi, I'm Olivia. I came to the project on April 23rd, and I originally came to do image and video capture, and that's what I've been doing here, along with other odds and ends around the project, but mostly focusing on video and image. Yeah, and that's me. Thank you so much.
Great. Well, it's so nice to meet you all and hear about your project. I've done work that sounds pretty similar, especially in Hawaii, where like the indigenous knowledge is so alive, and it's such a gift, like you're saying, to be able to learn from them and support them. So yeah, I'd love to learn more about what you're doing sometime. And so hopefully what I talk about today I can tailor it to your project, since this is basically like us having a conversation, which is awesome. I really like that. Okay, so I'll just start sharing my screen now. Oh, can you enable it, Neil?
It's Neil.
Oh, there we go. Okay.
Neil, you said something about muting. Do you want us to mute for like a first portion, or do you want to keep it open for the conversation?
Oh, just mute when she's talking until you have questions, then to unmute. Just for any,
Okay.
what happens is when there's a noise in the room, then the screen switches over to you guys and then goes back to Leah.
Yeah. Okay. All right. So some of you know me, but some of you don't. And so just a brief introduction. I have really been studying like how living systems work and how humans can be in alignment with them for a long time, more than 25 years. And really working, not just theoretically and studying it, but practicing it as well, and worked in a variety of projects like community development from the ground up, like building new communities and also adapting existing communities, working in agriculture and food systems, restoration of systems of small sizes to tremendous regional sizes, and all kinds of other regenerative projects as well. So it's been really fun. And I spent the last, from about 2015 to 2019, really studying how do we kind of formalize regenerative development and design as a practice, and how do we create some sort of agreement, right, about like what it is we should be doing, what constitutes regenerative, what it is. And so I understand that within this field, because of the nature of the field itself, it's kind of, up for interpretation. But a lot like with sustainability, we're in this place where we're deciding collectively what it means and how to do it, and how do we know when we've done it. And especially with regenerative development and design, it's really important to be coordinated in the way we're doing it in this time that we're in, where we really need to make some drastic changes pretty quickly. So I created this framework, regenerative community development framework, that includes process tools and evaluation tools to help us, in that endeavor. And so I've talked about those in previous sessions. If any of you haven't seen them, you're welcome to go back and view them. And today I wanted to talk a little bit more about this coordination piece. So I mentioned in the last jam session something called PANARCHY. So we're going to talk about that today. And as we go through this, like with all these sessions, I hope you're applying it to your own project and thinking about how it applies. And then we'll have a period to talk about specifically how these concepts can apply to your project and help your project. And so here's just some ways you can contact me and the institutions I'm associated with. The Regenerative Living Institute is a nonprofit, and Core Collaborative is the for-profit. And I'll show this again at the end. Okay, so as I've explained in previous jam sessions, I like to conceptualize regenerative development in communities, because really nature exists as communities of communities. Like everything is in relationship, and everything only exists because of those relationships. So community really just means how we can conceptualize these relationships and the components that are creating the relationships and the emergence and dynamics that occurs because of those relationships. So using the word community just helps us remember that. There are different ways of describing communities in different fields, but for our purposes, that's how I like to use it. And so here's a diagram that helps us understand that communities exist at all scales, from individual up through regional and even the globe. And I've talked about this in previous jam sessions, so you can go back and see more about that there. But they're all nested and networked. So like an individual is part of a community, which is part of a landscape, which is part of a city, and cities network to form regions and so on. And when we're doing regenerative work, what we're really trying to do is implement changes that will manifest thrivability across scales. So upscale, I apologize for my dogs barking outside. Hope that doesn't distract you too much. So we're trying to manifest thriving living systems, not just at the project scale, so like your farm, but also upscale. So the communities the farm is a part of, we're trying to impact and create thrivability at those scales as well. And that works in the opposite direction as well. Like if we are an individual working on a farm, hopefully we're going to become more thriving because we're working on the farm. So that's the farm's impact on lower levels as well. Let's see. And so you see the purple arrows for scale, right? So thrivability can manifest across scale, upscale. And the white arrow shows us it also manifests downscale. So you can imagine, like when a landscape is thriving, the components of the landscape will also be thriving. Okay, and so this is a tool I've talked about before that helps us conceive this idea of communities and working across scales a little bit differently, where we're looking at individual, site, like the farm, community, maybe watershed or landscape, city or region, and so on. So we can see how they're all nested. And then we're adding these components of flow, what I like to call flows. So in any living system, there are lots of components that create it. But for our purposes, there's some we can kind of focus on that we can impact and that we can look at to see how can we help those flows of these components be healthier across scales. So for farms, obviously food, right, is a huge component. You might be looking at how your farm is impacting not just the farm itself, but the larger community and the watershed or landscape scale and so on. And you're going to also look at how is food connected to soil, right? Like, are we producing food in a way that makes the soil healthier? Not just on the farm scale, but across scales. Are we producing food in a way that's increasing the nutrients? You know, are we producing food in a way that's making the water healthier? You know, and so on. So you're really looking at how are all these things connected and how can we use one, like what we call a nodal intervention point, like food, to help make all those other elements of a system healthier. And so that really is the key with living systems thinking, is to be able to do this and see how it is, and then see how it can change and how our role as humans can help these relationships change to manifest more thrivability. And we're doing this across scales of space, as you see in the purple circles, and also time, of course, because everything's changing over time and we're working throughout time. Okay. So I mentioned last time how the word heterarchy, and there were some questions about that. So I wanted to address that because this is a really helpful concept, I think, for understanding what we're doing as regenerative change agents. And this will tie into those graphics I just showed you as well, where things are nested across scales and affect each other across scales. Okay, so in this field of complex adaptive systems or living systems, right, it helps to conceptualize systems as holarchic, so self-organizing holarchic systems, right? So the holarchy means you've got these smaller components, the holons, which you can see here, which are whole systems unto themselves. They have these dynamics that are very strong within that holon, within that system. And so the strength of those interactions and connections and relationships, you know, help us define it and say, yes, this is a whole that we can work with. It's a holon. So your farm is a holon. But then there are these scales of nestedness and networkedness that you can see here in the diagram. So like your farm, for example, might be connected to another farm, right? And that would be maybe, you know, one of these levels where you see the green circles connected to other green circles. So they're each wholes, but when you network them, they create another whole, right, with different characteristics, but it's still a whole. And it still creates these different emergent properties because of the relationships and the components. And you could think about that within your farm as well. Like if you think of your farm as a living system, you could think of the holons within your farm, and you could think of the relationships of those holons creating the whole health of the farm. Right? So maybe your farm then is at this, maybe the second level up where you see the 3 green dots, you know, green circles within the blue circles, and they're connected. And then on the right side is 4 green circles. So maybe that's kind of your farm level. And then at the lower levels, that's within your farm, and you see how the organisms are connected and the water is connected. And maybe you've got, you know, part of the farm that's heavily populated by bees, and you have like a lot of bee dynamics going on there, and maybe that's a holon. And maybe another part of the farm is more heavily influenced by humans. Like maybe that's where you do the food processing and cleaning and, you know, sorting and all that. And so like that's another holon, but they're related and they're connected, and together they make a different holon. Okay, so then when they're nested and networked in this way, we call it a holarchy. Okay, and so these patterns of relationships translate into emergent behaviors that co-create the identity of the system and its self-organization. So again, it's important to just, like, when you're working regeneratively, to be able to see these kinds of relationships and see the holons, because, you know, we want to work with nature as nature, not against it. So we need to be able to pick up on these patterns that are occurring in nature, and then know where we can intervene or we can have a positive impact as catalysts for thrivability. So being able to use this as a tool to help us, you know, is very helpful, I think, very important. Okay, here's another way of conceptualizing it. Just, you know, just a different way that maybe could help you. And these can get very complicated. I've shown a few diagrams in the past that it looks like spaghetti. There's so many components and relationships, but in reality, there are 4 or 5 key components and relationships in any given system that we can really identify as driving it, and we can look at those as where we can have a positive impact. Let me go back, because I didn't use the word heterarchy. Yeah, because that's not on here, but this could also be called a heterarchy. Oh, that word is on here. So this is called a heterarchy when you've got a nested and networked system of holons, basically. And so I don't want people to think that this is like a top-down hierarchical structure, because that's not exactly how it works. And I'll explain that in a little bit. We're getting to that with the next few diagrams. But this should not be like misinterpreted as a typical hierarchical structure, because, like I said, each holon, right, is its whole system and has its whole dynamics and is in and of itself very powerful. Okay. Now, this is a pretty important concept in living system thinking that can help us. So this is called PANARCHY. It's also called an adaptive cycle. So every living system that's ever been studied goes through these cycles, and there are certain deviations from this pattern in particular, but it generally holds. And so it's good for us to be aware of this pattern, because it can help us understand where a system is in its progress and its adaptation, and therefore where our efforts will be best rewarded, or in other words, where our energy will have the best impact. Okay, so let's just start in the lower left quadrant that says R. Okay, now you'll see this is called exploitation, but it's not, that's an ecological word. That doesn't mean like taking advantage of people or exploiting nature. It means that there are resources available to aid and support growth and adaptation. So we could also call this phase a growth phase or an adaptation phase. Okay, so what's happening is there are new relationships coming together. Resources have been freed up. They're coming together in new ways, forming new relationships, and new things are emerging. So this is a very innovative phase when almost anything is possible. You see the word breakthrough innovation there. This is where that happens. There's rise and expansion of actors. You know, we don't have to use the word winning. This is from a while ago, this diagram, like early 2000s, developed by ecologists. So, you know, since then, we, I think, as a whole, have been more aware of the language we're using and how it's landing with certain groups. And this was not intended really for like social systems, even though this does apply to social systems, but it really described ecological systems really well. And so what they mean when they say winning is that out of this growth and adaptation phase, you know, certain relationships and certain emergences are going to be more successful than others, right? Those are just the ones that fit best in the context, in those larger contexts I showed you. So for example, like if we've got 10 farms in your region that are developing, the ones that are going to be the most successful are going to be the ones that provide the most value for the community. So in other words, they're going to provide, you know, foods that are the most nourishing for people, that people can afford, that people like the taste of, that are increasing ecosystem health and community health. You know, and there are a lot of other factors there. But those are the so-called winners in this diagram, right? They're just the ones that are of the most service to the greater wholes that they're a part of. That's how nature works. Always being in service, always adding value. And what we mean by adding value is creating more life. Okay. And then as we move through this exploitation phase or the growth phase, and those maybe 10 farms get narrowed down to like 5, right? The 5 that are adding the most value. Then what happens is we can get locked into what's called a conservation phase. And in conservation, what happens is, certain things have been found to work. And so the system kind of just gravitates to those patterns, right? It just keeps repeating those patterns that work. And this is fine for a little while, but what ends up happening is you see that blue star that says lock-in and rigidity trap. So what happens is eventually these relationships and patterns no longer actually serve the whole because everything's changing around it. And if that system can't change as well, it can no longer be of service. And so then what happens is that big red circle star breakdown, right? Like if it's not in service anymore, it won't continue to exist. And so then those relationships break down and you start to free up resources again, or you start to free up that energy in the system to create new relationships. So then you go through this release phase where everything is kind of reorganizing, old structures and institutions and regimes, just break down because they're no longer in service. And so I'm sure you can relate what I'm saying right now to a lot of things that are going on in the world where we're seeing that old structures that no longer serve anymore are breaking down. And so depending on the scale that we're looking at, this phase can go really fast or it can go really slow. We'll talk about that in a minute. But on a scale like a farm, this can happen very quickly if you figure out, oh, this planting technique we're trying is not working, we need to change it. So that can be very fast. If you're talking about a whole country and like the policies it institutes to support farming and agriculture, that might take decades to shift once they realize, okay, we need to shift our way of farming. These old ways aren't working. We need to support new ways. That could take a very long time. So once we have this release and resources are freed up, we enter into this reorganization phase, right, where suddenly new actors can come in, new relationships can be formed, resources can be used in different ways. And this is when you can have radical or revolutionary innovation, right? Just like things can be completely different in ways that no one could have predicted, no one could have thought of. And then you have an expansion of pioneer actors, like people just trying, and organisms and relationships just trying like totally what seemed like crazy things that no one ever thought of, right? And then you start the whole cycle over again. So I'm sure you can think of how this has happened like in human history, certainly like the digital revolution. I think we can see a lot of this in that. We can see this like in the Industrial Revolution, right? There have been a lot of things that have happened in human history that follow this cycle. And you can see this in nature, like, for example, when a fire will go through a place that is fire adapted, right? The fire serves as that big red circle that helps to release resources and relationships and helps the whole system to reorganize and then renew itself. Okay, and this happens across scales, like I said, like there's a small scale, right? So you could even think of the smallest scale as you as an individual. Of course, even within your body, there are smaller systems at work, right? Like you've got a whole bacterial ecosystem in your body, and you've got your organs, and you've got like viruses. It's like your body is full of other organisms doing work and creating your health. And then you as an individual, right, you're part of a community, so that's like the middle scale. So maybe you're part of the farm. And then the farm is part of some larger community, right, that you're all trying to be of service and value to, and you're trying to help improve it. And at the smallest scales, right, this adaptive cycle can go very, very quickly, right? Like you can make changes within yourself in a matter of days or moments even. And then at the middle scale, the farm, it might take a little longer, it might take a week or a month or a year, depending on what you're doing. And at those largest scales, like I said, maybe the country scale, it might take decades. Okay, so this just describes it a little bit better. And this, I really just want to put the words on here in case people want to come back and look at these later. So that's what that's for. Let's see if I need to go back to anything. Okay, this explains the scales a little bit more about how we have the shorter, faster scales and the longer, slower scales. Okay, let me go back. I want to go back to this one. I want to talk about. I'm not sure. Well, let's maybe just open it up for questions now, because the point of showing you this is that, like I said, if we can start to see these patterns in nature and these cycles and know what cycle we're in, right? Like what cycle is the systems we're working, are the systems that we're working in, we can better use our energy. So for example, like if you're working on a policy level, like the national policy, you're going to have to expect it's going to take much time and you're just going to have to be patient. And if you know that it's in a conservation phase at the national level, you're going to know that, maybe the best role that you can play is to nudge things in a way that it is going to like release and break down. And maybe if you're in the reorganization phase, maybe the best thing you can do is to bring in new people, new actors, and help make new connections, right, and network. So part of this is understanding where you are in the cycles, where your systems are that you're working in and hoping to affect. And then you as an individual, right? Like what can you bring? Where are you in your personal cycle? And how does that interact with all these others? And where can you best put your energy? And of course, none of us work alone. We're all part of these teams and groups. So being able to do this at that scale as well, your team and group, can be very helpful so that your team can, make the best impacts possible. I think I'm going to stop now. If you want me to show any slide in particular, let me know. But otherwise, we can just, talk about how this might apply to your projects or your personal lives, or whatever calls to you right now.
Yeah, quick question, Leah. Did you explain the X and Y axes and how they relate to the 4 quadrants?
Okay, yes. So this is like a simplified version of a more complex diagram where you see on the bottom the connectedness, right? Okay, so like in the conservation phase, the actors are few. Like I said, they start to kind of get whittled down to a smaller number, and the relationships then are also smaller. And so the connectedness increases. So in other words, you've got a few actors, a few relationships, and they're like tight. They are rigid, they're locked in. So the connectedness is very strong. Now the potential increases in that reorganization phase, right? Where you've got new actors coming in, new relationships being developed. So the potential of what can emerge is, almost limitless. So that's what those axes are. Thank you, Neil. And also let me say another thing about this. Actually, let me go to this one. So in PANARCHY, we see that, the bigger scales like global provide like a guiding force for smaller scales like local. And so you see these words, remember and revolt. Okay, so like at a global scale, let's think of the Earth as a whole, right? The Earth is holding right now and always these patterns that work for her overall health, right? Like climate patterns and biomes and things like that. And they're all in these relationships that work to create the health of the whole. And so each scale is going to change at a pace that is best for its health. So at a global scale, right, because it's so big, this change is slower, and it's holding these patterns for the smaller scales like regional and local that help to preserve its health as well, right? So like at a regional or bioregional scale, things are going to change so quickly that we're going to have like a radically different species assemblage because the global system just won't allow that, right? Like our weather patterns and such just aren't going to change very quickly to an extent that we're going to have totally new species and relationships in a few years or even a few decades, right? We're talking about millions of years. So those scales being slow, they have a purpose, right? They have a purpose to make sure that the health of the system is maintained. And then the smaller scales being able to change very quickly, they have the same purpose actually, right? When things are no longer working for them because of these like constraints of the higher scales, they're creating these new relationships, innovation. And when enough innovation happens at enough of these smaller scales, they can do what is called revolt in this picture, right? They basically are going to leverage that nested and networked relationship that we saw before, and then change can cascade upscale. So let's imagine, like in your farm scenario, that you've got the 10 farms and you're all able to work together and say, okay, for the highest health and good of the communities we're a part of, we all agree that this is how we should be acting. These are the roles we should play. This is how we should be farming. This is how we should be in relationship to our community to make it healthier, to add value to it. And then maybe, you're doing such a good job at improving the health of those larger wholes that more people want to become farmers, and you start to help them. And so maybe you've got 20 now, and then maybe that becomes 40, and then maybe you catalyze, right, the shift in your entire region so that you're creating healthier bioregions. And then maybe that's happening in several different bioregions so that you're shifting and creating greater health in the entire country. Right? And so this is how change can cascade upscale. And really, this is what we're trying to do in regenerative development and design. We're trying to, work in ways that increase the health of the systems that we're working on directly, the project scale, but also those larger scales we're part of, so that we can network and network them within these nested systems and catalyze change upscale. So that's very exciting. So I think it's helpful to be able to see heuristics like this and work with them so that we can best catalyze that change.
This is a follow-up to the other slide, the y-axis.
Yes, that one. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, could you explain, potential production, that as well?
Yeah. So again, the potential is like, when you've got these new relationships forming and new actors, we don't know which way the system's going to go. We don't know what's going to be the most beneficial necessarily. So that means there's increased potential. We can't necessarily predict what's going to happen. So it's an opportunity, right, for new things to emerge. So that's potential. And production can mean the same thing. Like in nature, after you see a disturbance in nature, like the fire example, right, you see increased production because all these nutrients have been released, all these new relationships are forming, and you see an increase of like production of in plant species, animal species, fungal species, everything is just producing more. It's just like, producing a lot. And that's also what's happening there in the exploitation phase and growth phase, that things are just in production mode. It's just like, everything is just growing, like just more life expressing itself.
And that's one thing, like, let's say domination culture or civilization doesn't do very well is release. Power builds and grows and holds, just like companies and shareholders growing the value of the company, but they don't want to release.
Yeah, it's important to know when to release, right? And this is, you can even apply this to you as an individual because you're a system. And so for every system, this is true, right? It's good to know when to release and when to reorganize.
I have a quick, yeah, hey. Hi, first, my sincere apologies. I'm sorry for showing up so late. I know I hesitated coming, I was so late, so sorry about that. I have a couple questions. So I just jumped off on while you were talking about this slide. And my first question would be, you were asking, try to identify where in the cycle you are within your project or even personally. And that struck a question for me, which is, how do you determine how long the entire cycle is? Is it because it could be I imagine for some system it could be a lot longer and slower, and for some others very short. So if I want to know where in this cycle I am, I was thinking I need to know how long the entire cycle is, and then I can maybe figure out how long, where I stand.
Yeah. I don't know if you were here for this one where we talked about how smaller scales move and change much more quickly, and bigger scales like global,
Okay.
Very,
That makes
very
sense.
slowly. Yeah. And so you can, and this is part of developing what we call pattern literacy. Like you start to be able to see, things that are happening in the systems, and you start to learn the indicators of change, right? Or the indicators of being locked in. And so like Neil was saying, like it's pretty easy to see in social systems when they're locked in, right? You've just got like a few people or organizations that are clearly in charge, like dictating what happens in the system, and nothing else is changing, right? No one else can budge the system.
This is becoming very apparent.
Yes. But the other thing that's happening at the same time is stuff like what we're doing, right? Like you're always going to have at the smaller scales, these, we call them grassroots movements, where at the smaller scales, the actors and the relationships are still forming, they're still moving. And so it's this dual relationship you can see, right? As the bigger scales become ever more locked in and entrenched, the smaller scales basically have more motivation or more energy to do what they're doing. To, like, from a social point of view, we can apply conscious reflection and motivation, and we can say, all right, we're recognizing what's happening, and a lot of people are like, this is not okay, we need to change things. And that's what's happening, right? So all these like grassroots movements are developing, and they're networking because they're thinking along similar lines, and they all understand like we have to work together to make this change. And so eventually, that is going to catalyze upscale, and then this scale, the bigger scale, is going to collapse and release. And in nature, it's a similar thing, right? It's not conscious or intentional, but the similar energetic dynamics are at play. And so with pattern literacy, when you develop this, like I said, you can learn to see these indicators of where the system is, when it's ready to shift, or where you can like poke it or nudge it to help it shift. And that's part of what we want to develop as regenerative practitioners as well, is that ability to see that.
And one more quick question. So in your other slide, when you are in this kind of production mode, this one, so exploitation and then conservation, why would the potential increase while you are kind of in this conservation mode when things?
That's a little,
it's
a little confusing in this. There's a three-dimensional diagram that might show this better, but I chose not to show it because it also can be confusing. So the potential increases in that reorganization phase, the alpha phase.
That certainly makes a lot of sense, yes.
Yeah, and then the potential, or the production, is increasing in the exploitation phase, and the connectedness is increasing in that conservation phase. So it's good to have connectedness and relationships, but when it becomes too much, like the connections are just too rigid and not able to flow, I mentioned this word before, flow, that's death. When any system is not able to flow, right? Think about life force energy, right? Just like even within our bodies. If things are not flowing at a rate that supports the health of the system will die. I mean, it's just that simple. And so in this way of thinking about things, PANARCHY, that's what's happening in the conservation phase. Things are too locked in, too rigid. The connectedness is just too strong, that things are not flowing, and the system, like, it has to release because it's dying. And so when it releases, that's like a rebirth.
The part of the diagram which I misunderstood at the beginning was that, why is growth and release at the bottom of potential production? But that's just where it starts.
Yes. Yeah, and maybe I could show you the three-dimensional diagram next time, because there's another piece of this in the three-dimensional diagram that's resilience, which we've all, heard that word, and I think have a basic understanding of what it means. And so, when you're at like peak conservation, there's not much resilience. It's very low. And that's why it's vulnerable to collapse, right? So it does collapse. And so then you go through the release phase, and the reorganizational phase. And when a system has the most resilience is actually at a certain point in the exploitation phase, when things are growing, new relationships, they're still forming, but not to the same extent as in reorganization. But in exploitation, there's this like magical point where you can still form new relationships and new actors can still come in, right? If things are not working well, like you still have this magic like area where you can still change and it's not totally devastating to the system. So really, what we're trying to do if we're being very intentional about being regenerative in the way we live and the way we interact with systems, so we're trying to make sure we never get into that conservation phase where things are so totally locked in that the system is just not healthy. And so, we've seen in human systems, we have this ability to try to transcend the laws of nature, which we can't ever actually do. But because we're trying, we put ourselves in these situations where, we're getting into these conservation phases that are terribly unhealthy for us and the rest of life. And we're holding them there for unnaturally long periods of time due to our technology, and other things. And so if we're being regenerative agents of change, we want to make sure this doesn't happen, that we never get into conservation phases that are unhealthy for the system as a whole. And we want to be able to see when it's time, like to reorganize and try some new things and, release resources and when it's time to grow also, right? There are times for growth. And then there are times when in the growth phase, we might say, okay, this is enough now. And we need to think about reorganizing, right? We need to be self-reflective and we need to constantly be assessing the health of the system. So if you've seen some of the previous jam sessions where I've shown these charts that are just a tool, right, to help us think about certain characteristics of systems, for regenerative systems. This is one of those things that's in the chart. And we're thinking about, we're being reflective in a way that will help us know when it is time to release and reorganize, when it is time to grow, So have you found this helpful for your projects at all?
We have a question.
Yeah. Yes, I'm definitely finding it helpful. And I guess the question is, would it be appropriate to imagine this infinity symbol within the individual holons?
Yes, absolutely. So, within your farm, these cycles absolutely apply. And it can help you when you're looking at the farm, look at the dynamics that are happening within it on all the scales and how they can relate and work together to create the health of the complete farm. So do you want to, if you know some examples, you could tell me, because I don't know that I'm actually sharing good ones. So this is when it applies to a farm for the smaller holons.
And from this diagram, it seems like our project is in the reorganization phase. And then it would also then be appropriate to look at the new people coming in and evaluating whether they are also at a reorganization phase. Would those be the most compatible people to bring in, like the expansion of the pioneer actor? Or can they personally be at any stage of this cycle, but just maybe find a different area within the holon of this project itself to plug into?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think it I think it's good to have a mix of people and what they can bring to the project, especially depending on your goals for the project and how the project is fitting within the larger community and other related projects, right? And what the bigger picture is in the whole region, or what you're hoping to do to add value to the community. Like you might want somebody who is a little conservative, right? Who can make sure that this is successful because they've had other experiences with similar projects, and they know generally, what works and what doesn't. And so they can bring that knowledge, but you want them also to be open enough to be able to be flexible, right, for what other people can bring to the project and incorporate those insights, right, which might be and probably are very valuable. So this is an example where, and this happens in a lot of organizations, right, where you've got either one or a few people who are kind of holding at a larger scale, bringing to the table things that in their experience have worked, have not worked. They kind of hold the vision and the organizational structure, but they're also allowing for all these other phases to happen, right? They're bringing in new people who can help to reorganize things. They're supporting this growth phase and adaptation phase. So they're kind of like, if we look at the nested panarchy across scales, they're kind of like the global scale, right? Where they're holding it all, right, in a very loving way and allowing it all to happen in all the phases. But they're making sure the thing as a whole, the project as a whole, is going to be successful, right? Like the Earth, no matter what happens at the lower scales, like she'll be fine, she'll go on. It might take millions of years or billions of years, but she'll be fine, right? What happens at the lower scales, right? That's kind of, they're much more concerned, those lower scales, with what's happening on their time scales, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Now, I have one more question, which is that, is there, I think Cedric, I apologize. Cedric. What Cedric brought up about data mining, and I wonder if there's like a list of questions or criteria made to determine which phase of the cycle that a system might be in, but particularly
Yes.
like a questionnaire, like.
Yes. So there's a great book called PANARCHY that you could get, which goes into all of this in detail. And it's a fascinating book for many reasons, but it does provide those indicators and the questions to ask and ways to shift the system. Really good book. The authors are Gunderson and Halling. There's also a place called the Resilience Institute in Stockholm. They do a ton of work in this field. They're pretty much considered like the experts in the field. So they're interesting because I would actually say that they're a great example of how all these phases of the cycle come together, right? Like they have an aspect of them that's conservation. They have an aspect of them that's reorganization and so on. So I would even look to them as a good example of like how this works in a human-dominated system.
And that's the Resilience Institute
Yes, Resilience Institute.
in Stockholm, you said?
Uh-huh. Yeah, and they have a lot of publications on their website for free. That book I mentioned, PANARCHY, it was published in, I think, 2001. So it's quite affordable to buy now.
Thank you.
Okay. So I'm curious about your farm project and how, like you said, you're working with the Mayans, which is amazing. And so I'm curious how Like how you see your project being able to catalyze change upscale and maybe help shift the practices in your region, you know, to be more regenerative.
That's a great question. Thank you so much. It's Leah. What I can do, I would love to share my screen for a second. You can see the picture. It's not on full screen right now, but we have here the building where we are sitting in right now, right? And it is very remote. It is in a nature reserve in the jungle, in the forest. And we will be living around here in the camps around it. But what we have, where we are connected to the neighbors, it's a nature research and monitoring station. And this is where we are connected to the Mexican government for the forest and reforestation or rewildering project and for the animals or for it's a nature protected area, so we need to report to there. And on the other side, we have here on the right, we have the wildlife rescue center where the Mexican government will be bringing us animals they caught from the black market, for example, and then we can rewild them. And the whole jungle is surrounded by communities and by Mayan people or just normal villages, and then some of them are hunters, and these hunters they are not well educated about the different seasons and about how to protect them, these kind of areas, and how to interact with them. And we will be engaging with them and try to invite them to be our how do you call these, rangers, so that we will be working with them together because they know the forest and the jungle the best way, so they can educate the let's say colleges or children coming from the school. They want to know how to walk in the jungle, how to read paths and all that. So the hunters will be able to, instead of going into the jungle and hunting all the time, just have another opportunity, have another chance where they can collaborate with the wider, bigger system here, the ecosystem. And then we will be educating them about the different seasons, and so when they respect the seasons, they can go and hunt. But it's all the year long. So if they know about the different seasons, then we have a difference in relationship with the jungle. And this is the approach right now. I don't know how it will go further in the future. Maybe at some point all of them will be vegan because we will be cooking real good vegan food here, right? And then they don't need the hunting anymore. But this is all a wider vision that we have. And thank you for your support.
Yeah, it's great to hear about that. There's this famous case study of something similar in Mexico, in the Baja Peninsula. You might be interested in, where they worked with people who used to be poachers. Basically, you know, they were just devastating the ecosystem, the ocean or the Gulf ecosystem, and they enlisted them as stewards, basically, of the ecosystem. You know, provided them with essentially a different way of thinking about their relationship to nature and different ways of providing for themselves as well, right? Because everyone has these survival needs. And it just transformed everything. I mean, the ecosystem went from being like on the brink of extinction to being thriving. So yeah, great approach to have it integrated that way. Okay, well, it's 2 o'clock, so I wish you all a fantastic rest of the day. And you saw my email addresses at the beginning, so please feel free to email me if there's anything in particular you want to hear about next time. I'm happy to, respond to your needs. Yeah, or if you have any other questions, please feel free to reach out.
Is this recording gonna be made available somewhere?
Yes, Neil posts it on the C's website, I think.
Well, so Leah also has her own YouTube channel. The Regenerative Living Institute has their own YouTube channel. So they're all nicely concentrated in one place there.
Yes.
Just go to the YouTube and Regenerative Living Institute, and we'll get the recording from last week on there within 24 hours. Yeah.
Yes, we'll do that.
Yeah.
We'll make that
Awesome.
happen.
Thanks so much.
Okay. And thank you, Neil. Thanks, everybody. See you next
Good
week.
Thank you.